Chapter 13, Part 3, the cerebrum. Remember, the cerebrum is different from the cerebellum. We're not talking about that little branching part of the brain on the posterior side. We're talking about the largest portion of the brain, the cerebrum. It's composed of a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. The cortex is the outer surface. The cortex is made up of these folds that are gyri or gyrus, and the depressions in between the gyri are called sulci or sulcus. There are specific sulci and fissures also associated with the cerebrum. There's a longitudinal fissure, which basically is the large, big groove that separates the two hemispheres. It basically separates the brain into two halves, the right and left side. There's the lateral fissure, which separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. It's not as noticeable, but it is there. And then there's the central sulcus, which separates the frontal and parietal lobes. Again, not as noticeable as that longitudinal fissure, but it is there. The cerebral medulla is the white matter between the cortex and the nuclei, and then the basal nuclei is the gray matter found within the medulla. So the cerebrum, like I said, there's different sulci there. I'm not going to get into the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. It's just different parts of the cerebrum itself when you start dividing it into its different parts. But the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobes, those are fairly straightforward with being able to find and locate. And then you can see here on this slide that I have the functions of the frontal lobe are voluntary motor function, motivation, aggression, sense of smell, mood, personality, and decision-making. Parietal lobe, reception and evaluation of sensory information, except for smell, hearing, and vision. The occipital lobe is the reception point and integration of visual input. And the temporal lobe is the reception and evaluation location for smell and hearing, as well as memory, abstract thought, judgment. I don't know why this is like this. I missed this when I was setting it up. But the insular lobe is also known as insula or insular lobe, is deep within these other lobes inside of the brain. And you don't have to know so much about that. So we're going to keep going here. So you can see here's an illustration, or rather a picture of the cerebrum. Make it a little bigger. And you can see when I said that longitudinal fissure is the really noticeable one. You can't see these other ones as well, but they're there. So these bumps, these wrinkles are the gyrus, and then the grooves in between those, these little groove spaces in between the gyri, are the sulci. All right, cerebral medulla, which is basically the medulla of the cerebrum. So it's made up of white matter between the cortex and the nuclei. There are a couple of other things here I'll just mention. So the association fibers are connections within the same hemisphere, and the commissural fibers connect one hemisphere to the other through specifically the corpus callosum, and I'm going to point that out in a little bit. And the projection fibers are tracks between the cerebrum and other parts of the brain and spinal cord. So let me find the picture I want to show you really quickly here. I apologize. So this guy right here is solid. It's actually made of white matter, is the corpus callosum. So this, and I think I'm going to talk about this here in a little bit, is the part that kind of connects the two hemispheres together. So the hemispheres here are not physically connected, right? That fissure, that longitudinal fissure separates it, and that longitudinal fissure goes all the way down to the corpus callosum, and this is solid across both sides of the brain. It's just cut in half here in this image. see if I can figure out where I was now. Okay. All right, moving on. The basal nuclei, they're found in the cerebrum as well as the diencephalon and the midbrain, and they help to control motor function. All right, the limbic system is part of the cerebrum and also part of the diencephalon. And the limbic system is directly related to emotions as well as basic survival functions such as memory, reproduction, and nutrition. So if you remember nothing else about the limbic system, remember it has to do with emotions. Okay, so we'll just keep going here. And the limbic system is actually multiple areas of the brain, so you absolutely do not have to identify that. So moving on to the meninges, the ventricles, and the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so the meninges, I mentioned these when we talked about the spinal cord, 3 layers, the dura mater, most superficial, very tough, thick outer covering, connective tissue covering, and it helps to protect the brain and surround the brain. The arachnoid mater is the next one under that. It's kind of like a webbing-like layer, and the pia mater is adhered tightly to the surface of the brain, makes the surface of the brain real shiny and glistening. And if you were to dissect like we look at a sheep brain when we have class in person, and you can get the tip of the probe right under that pia mater and lift it up, and it looks like the thinnest piece of cellophane, but it's like adhered to the surface of the brain. And then there's a couple of spaces between those layers, the subdural space and the subarachnoid space. The subdural space contains serous fluid, and the subarachnoid space contains cerebrospinal fluid, which is CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. Ventricles are spaces within the brain, or cavities within the brain. We have 2 lateral ventricles, a 3rd ventricle, and a 4th ventricle. So the first 2 lateral ventricles are not called the 1st and 2nd. They are just referred to as lateral ventricles. And then the 3rd and 4th are referred to as 3rd and 4th. So again, they're spaces or cavities within the cerebral hemispheres. The lateral ventricles are. The 3rd ventricle is found within the diencephalon. And the interventricular foramina join the lateral ventricles with the 3rd ventricle. So they're connected through the interventricular foramina. That's the lateral ventricles, and the 3rd ventricle are joined there. And the 4th ventricle is associated with the pons of the medulla, and they're connected to the 3rd ventricle by the cerebral aqueduct. So the cerebral aqueduct connects the 3rd ventricle to the 4th ventricle. So here's an image, an illustration of the ventricles in the brain, those spaces. CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, similar to serum of the blood, but not as much protein. Most of the protein is removed in CSF. The CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, bathes the brain and the spinal cord. It is a protective cushion around the CNS, helps to create a little bit of a buoyant environment for the brain, so your brain isn't slamming up against the side of your skull. The choroid plexus produces CSF, which fills the ventricles and other parts of the brain and spinal cord. The choroid plexus is composed of ependymal cells, the support tissue, and associated blood vessels. The choroid plexus is found in each ventricle, but most CSF is produced in the lateral ventricles. And then this is just a general overview of the flow, the flow of CSF. All right, there's an image. If you want to take a look at that, it shows the different cells there having to do with that, or the cells in the choroid plexus. So we're going to stop here and pick up on blood supply to the brain.